Hello, my name is Bryan Walsh. I'm the Executive Director of the Shroud of Turin Center here in Richmond, Virginia. We are putting together a brief series of presentations on a variety of topics, obviously including the Shroud of Turin, but we start the presentation series with the Star of Bethlehem, based on research we've done here over the past 2 or 3 years, to give you an insight into what it might have been and what it might mean. With that, now let's go and see what the Star of Bethlehem is all about. As you see on the slide, the Star of Bethlehem talks about what's occurring in the heavens. And unfortunately for us moderns, we don't look at the heavens very much anymore, except maybe on a TV show or go to a planetarium or something, which is great. But we're missing what's happening every day if you look up and watch the stars. A young poet caught some of the mystery of it in a poem she wrote back in 2017. This is just part of it. She talks about a crisp, cool autumn evening, stars filling the night up high, God, the great creator, decking out the sky. A garden lit by the moonlight, a rose kissed by his hand, the beauty he created, even the smallest piece of sand. So the heavens themselves proclaim the glory of God as described in the Psalms. And we're going to take that theme and tell you why it's important to watch the heavens even now. The skies proclaim the work of God's hands. When we look at the heavens through modern optical means and radio telescopes, etc., we see a phenomenal and awe-inspiring display of creation and enormity, and it's unfathomably wide and deep are the heavens, and yet God uses them in his way as a billboard to let us know what he's about and in effect communicate to us what he wants us to be about. God said, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years." So not only is it supposed to give people a sense of it's now daytime or nighttime, or it's fall or winter or summer or spring, but it also signifies signs. He actually communicates to his people using objects in the heavens. And we'll take you through how some of that's happened as we go through the presentation. Now, first of all, to differentiate, we're not talking here about astrology at all. Astrology is the belief that the stars are the primary cause of events and actions in people, and it was forbidden in the Jewish faith from which the Old Testament comes from. Astrology basically has a set of beliefs that are kind of twisted understanding of where this knowledge of the stars originally came from. Astrology thinks that by looking at the stars cause these events and actions, and therefore you're going to behave in a certain way. That's not what the sacred scriptures talk about at all. They talk about God using the stars to communicate with men, to communicate with us here on earth. And we'll just give you a few quotes. There's many of them that exist in the scriptures, but here's a few. He's the maker of the Bear and Orion, of the Pleiades and the constellations of the south. So we see now here written in Job, many centuries before the time of Christ, the description of the constellations we know as the Bear, Ursa Major, Orion, which is the bull, the Pleiades and the constellations of the south. They're all mentioned in the scriptures. So it's not like looking at the skies is a forbidden activity. You need to remember that you're looking at God's bulletin board, and he's not causing you to do something. That your free will does that. He's asking you to do something sometimes. Another quote comes from Psalms. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day, they pour forth speech. Night after night, they display knowledge. There is no speech or language where their voice is not heard. Their voice goes out to all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. So this communication from God isn't limited to anyone. It's given freely to the entire planet. And it's up to us to learn how to understand it and react to it accordingly. And again, in Romans, Paul writes, consequently, faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the words of Christ. But I ask, did they, meaning the Jews, not hear? Of course they did. And then he quotes the scripture we just heard. Their voices got out into all the earth and their words to the ends of the world. And of course, in the famous one, which is often read in various churches at this time of year, is the one where there will be signs in the sun and the moon and the stars, as noted by Luke. Those signs in the sun and the moon and the stars are communications to us, and they're happening even today. So we're going to look at in this particular presentation what the Magi saw, when they saw it, and what it had to do with the birth of a new king. This is the actual sky as seen in Bethlehem at dawn about 2,000 years ago. And if any of you are amateur astronomers or watch the skies a lot, you'll probably recognize one constellation, which is the Constellation of Orion up in this area here. And that constellation is notable for the fall sky. And you come down here, and there's a very bright object just above the horizon. It so happens that this happens to be two planets called wanderers back then by the Greeks, two planets coming together, looking almost like one object in the sky. And we'll talk a lot more about it as we go on. And as was said before, day to day pours forth speech, and night to night declares knowledge. Here is the sky with the constellations outlined so you can see it. There's Orion, as we just talked about up here, right? There's a mix of planets. This constellation here is Leo, the lion. That'll also become important to us as we travel on. So by naming these groups of stars in the sky, the ancients were looking at not just what the location of something was, but also what was its intent and what was it meant to signal. And they created records that go back 1,000 or more years prior to the time of Christ in terms of the details of some of the activities that were seen in the sky. In the Middle East, after watching the stars for millennia, by the 7th century BC, having created written records of various occurrences in the sky and in the nation, a guild of priests called the Baru, they were part of the Mesopotamian group of nations, and these were the Assyrians, for example, and the Babylonians, etc., developed to interpret various heavenly omens. So they looked at these records, and they, in effect, tried to correlate what they were seeing in the sky and what was happening in their nation, and try to correlate one with the other. So saying, when they see this in the sky, it probably means something like this. That was the idea of omen interpretation. The most senior of these priests, of the Baru, were called the Magos, plural Magi, who were advisors to the king. And the Magos were part of an advisory body that actually chose the king and then assisted him in his reign going forward. So who were these Magi? Well, recent historical research has uncovered a lot of things about them. They were a priestly caste, as we just mentioned, of the Medes, one of their 6 tribes dating to at least the 7th century BC. So their history goes back a long time before the time of Christ, for example. And they were creating and collecting records of sky events, eclipses, etc., for nearly 1,000 years. They kept meticulous records of sky conditions, as well as agricultural and political events. And their records of the sky conditions and positions have been used by modern astronomers to date eclipses that occurred back in the 7th or 8th centuries BC, etc., because they were that good in making these records useful. They were counselors to the king and members of the upper house of the Magistanes of the Parthian Empire. They specialized in proto-astronomy. They basically made astronomical records, what we would call, and dream interpretation, which is not what you would typically think of somebody who's a scientist, but back in the day, that's what they did. The Magi of the East were held in very high regard throughout the Parthian and Roman empires for their wisdom and knowledge. And in fact, if you go through some of the small states that existed at the time, you'll find almost all of them have the equivalent of the Magi, wise men guiding or advising their king as he makes his way through various decisions he has to make for the country. Not unlike, for example, the cabinet does in the United States. They're supposed to be wise men who advise the president here how to make the right decisions about a specific issue. And in the case of the Magi, they studied for a very long time before they could even assume this position. They commanded respect wherever they traveled, and their wisdom was respected throughout the region. As we noted, as part of their sky records, close conjunctions of the wanderers, which is what the Greeks call the planets, we now call, such as Jupiter and Venus, would have been observed and recorded by the Magi. And they would likely connect such an occurrence, depending on where it occurred in the sky, with the coming of a new leader. About 3 centuries after the Magi became sort of well known in Babylonia and the Assyrian Empire, they had greatly advanced their knowledge of the phenomenon they could see in the sky and developed the ability to project them based upon the recurring pattern of some of the things they saw. By 400 BC, they were using the mathematics of differences, very similar to calculus, to derive the positions of Jupiter, which is a key star in their way of looking at the skies. The skills they had and the precisions they were able to devise were not equal again until the mid-13th century AD, 1300s AD, excuse me. What you see here in the image is inside here are a series of wheels and gears that are turned up here by a dial, a crank, and that crank in turn, after the wheels and all are turned inside, moves a series of pointers here and on the back, which points to the positions of the 5 stars in the sky within a 1 degree of accuracy, as well as positions of eclipses and the moon on the back. So they actually had developed a physical analog computer, which the Greeks built, and used it to calculate lunar and planetary positions, lunar and solar eclipses, etc. It's called the Antikythera. And it was found in the ocean back around, it was found recently, but it dates to around 200 BC, indicating a very advanced knowledge of what was going on in the sky and the ability to translate it into, in effect, a calculating machine. So our typical vision of these people as kind of astrologers and kind of sort of dense people who lived in the past really doesn't bear up when you look at what they were able to accomplish. Now we go to the scriptures to see what was happening at the same time the wise men were sort of developing their roles in Babylonia, for example. About 585 BC, Nebuchadnezzar II, the king of the Babylonian Empire, conquered Jerusalem and took some of its inhabitants into captivity. He would again have to go back around 590 BC, or yeah, 590 and then 585, to reconquer the place because there was a rebellion that occurred, which it basically caused him to level most of what was left of Jerusalem at the time. Among the conquests in these periods were captives. One was a wealthy young religious man by the name of Daniel. Daniel was given the gift of interpreting dreams, and because of this, the king made him the Rab-Mag. Now, interpreting dreams is different than what you think of today. In the king's case, he didn't tell his advisors, for example, whom he first asked about this, what does this mean and what does that mean? He said, what did I dream and what does it mean? And since they couldn't tell him what he dreamt, they obviously couldn't tell him what it meant. In Daniel's case, he was able to do both. And as a result, he was made the Rab-Mag, the leader of the Magi. his wise men. So we have here a Jewish prophet, Daniel, becoming the head of the Magi of that era, and likely, as a result of his role, would have taught the Magi about the revelations of his God and what his God said was going to occur. The Magi would be taught about the coming of a most holy anointed one to the Jewish people based on one of Daniel's dreams. Daniel had dreams where he often envisioned events that both were occurring and would occur in the future. And that was the way God, in fact, communicated with him. So what this special dream said, it can be found in Daniel 9:20-26, it said, 70 weeks are decreed for your people and for your holy city. Then transgression will stop and sin will end. Guilt will be expiated. Everlasting justice will be introduced. Vision and prophecy ratified, and a most holy will be anointed. So he's being told this in his dream by, in effect, an angel. And the angel is talking about his people, his Daniel's people, and his holy city, Jerusalem. So we're talking about what we would call Judea or Israel today, right? And in 70 weeks, all this was supposed to happen. Well, Daniel had an interpretive key that the weeks meant years. It's possibly got it from just waiting 70 weeks and saying nothing happened, converted it to years, or is actually told that. Regardless, when he had that key, he could then begin to think about what the future of his people, the Jews, was going to be like, including the coming of this most holy one. The dreams went on to say, and recorded, know and understand this. From the utterance of the word that Jerusalem was to be rebuilt until one who was anointed and the leader, there shall be 7 weeks. During 62 weeks, it shall be rebuilt with streets and trenches in a time of affliction. After the 62 weeks, an anointed shall be cut down when he does not possess the city. And the people of a leader who will come shall destroy the sanctuary. So we have here described in Daniel a time period involved in which there will be a city rebuilt with streets and trenches, but it'll be in a time of affliction. It will not be easy times for his people. After the 62 weeks ends, the anointed will be cut down, and cut down as in it will be basically cut off or killed when he does not possess the city. So he's not a prominent Jew in terms of being one of the leaders. He's somebody else who's a leader. And later, the people of a leader who will come shall destroy the sanctuary, which is the Romans who came later on, and in 70 AD destroyed the temple. Analyzing this text now from a modern point of view, but even then, appears to point to 2 different anointed ones. The first is a leader who was anointed. And interestingly enough, Isaiah describes Cyrus as a leader anointed by God in Isaiah 45:1. And this occurred roughly 49 years after God spoke to Jeremiah in Jeremiah 33:10-11, which appears to match the first anointed prophecy. The timing of the second anointed prophecy, the anointed who was cut off, is a bit more difficult to pinpoint since it's not exactly precise as to when its time frame should begin. It's likely that it had to do with King Artaxerxes' decree to rebuild Jerusalem in roughly 430 BC, which started that clock. So therefore, based on all of this and that analysis, the Magi, the ones who stayed and followed Daniel after he died, would thus know that the Holy Anointed One was to come about roughly 434 years after the Jewish people returned to their homeland. Now, other specialists have looked at this and done all sorts of calendar work, etc., and state that they think that the Anointed One would be born roughly between 3, what we now call BC, and 0 BC, and would be cut off roughly in 33 AD, what we now call AD, based upon this calendar. Whether that's, in fact, too much projection on their part, can't say, but that's what they've calculated. So this is a very important prophecy as to the timing of the coming of the Anointed One. And from the Magi's point of view, it would sort of pinpoint the time they really needed to be looking at the skies to see if he came, because he was very important, according to Daniel. Further, since the Magi were students of other cultures as well as their own, under Daniel's influence, they would have become aware of the Jewish link to the symbol of the lion, from whence the Messiah was born. It comes from, one of the links comes from Genesis, chapter 49, 9 to 10. It says, Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down. He crouched as a lion and as a lioness. Who dares rouse him up? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he comes to whom it belongs, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. That's a direct prediction of the Messiah, coming, in effect, couched somehow as a lion's whelp. There's also a prediction of a star in the prophecies of Balaam. It says, Balaam says, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob. A scepter shall rise out of Israel. This is a king to be born, and the star will mark his coming. The Jews look for that as a sign of the Messiah. So, to see what the stars look like around the time of the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, we first need to estimate it when it might have occurred based upon the historical events that we know about. The Jewish historian Josephus describes the events surrounding the death of King Herod, who was the despot who ruled Judea at the time of Jesus' birth. Josephus tells us that Herod died after a lunar eclipse and before the celebration of Passover. Now, many people have been taught that the lunar eclipse that's being described here occurred in 4 BC, because there was a lunar eclipse in 4 BC. The problem is that lunar eclipse occurred in March of 4 BC, and Passover was only a short time thereafter, so it would not have been possible to conduct the necessary Roman rituals required for the burial of a Roman leader of a country. They'd have a march that would go only a certain number of leagues a day, of stadia a day. Then they'd rest and they'd march again. So it would take a series of days. People would come from around the various states of the Roman Empire to be part of the funeral. So it would take time to assemble. So that particular eclipse does not like it gives enough time for any of those events to really have occurred. So as obvious as Jesus was born before Herod died, then the eclipse mentioned by Josephus can help us define the likely period of Jesus' birth. As I mentioned, there's an eclipse on March 14th of 4 BC, and also there's a full lunar eclipse of January 10th of 1 BC, which gives you roughly 3 months plus to be able to do everything if Herod died shortly after that eclipse. So that seems to much better fit the requirements of an emperor, of a ruler under the Roman dominion, to be able to properly fit it in his death. So that's most likely the eclipse that Josephus was referring to when he talked about Jesus' birth. As I mentioned, recent historical research has found that only the January 10th 1 BC eclipse meets all the requirements necessary to fulfill the evidence noted. Therefore, it's likely that Jesus was born in the 2-year period prior to January 10th, 1 BC. Why do I say 2 years? Because that's the time period Herod used to say, kill all those 2 years or younger, when he sent out his soldiers after the Magi left Bethlehem. That 2-year period is mentioned, and we'll talk about it when we go through Matthew. At the same time all this is occurring, there are key events occurring in the Roman Empire as well, which have been overlooked until fairly recently. In 3 BC, Caesar Augustus sent out a decree to all the Roman people to pledge an oath of allegiance to him in preparation for honor to be bestowed upon him. So all the Roman people around the world, the Roman Empire, including the lands the Roman Empire was in, had to make a pledge of allegiance to Caesar Augustus, and had to do it on a timely basis because he was about to be promoted to the pater patriae of the country, of the empire. To facilitate census taking and tax enrollments, which took place from time to time in the Roman Empire, those activities were almost always held between August and October. So August, September, October. Why? That gave the people who were conducting the harvest the appropriate amount of time, given where the empire ranged, to be able to attend to their enrollment and get back and harvest their goods, or harvest them before they go to the enrollment. So that's why that period was chosen. 2 BC marked the 750th anniversary of the founding of Rome. Romulus and Remus supposedly founded it, and was a year of celebration in the empire. And on February 5th, 2 BC, the Roman Senate bestowed on Augustus the prestigious title of Pater Patriae, having received in Rome the pledges of allegiance from the peoples of the entire empire. So if in the story of the birth of Christ, Jesus and Mary, or rather Joseph and Mary, have to go for the calling, they saw a tax call. It's not a tax calling. It's a pledge of allegiance to Caesar Augustus. They would have to do it before February 5th of 2 BC, obviously, and if it's in August and October, probably in August through October of 3 BC. So the scriptures tell us that the Anointed One was born when Herod was king, was born around the time of a decree issued by Caesar Augustus. We just saw that. Was born when sheep were in the fields, which likely referred to the late summer, early fall time frame. That's one of the times you'll find them in the fields a lot. It was signaled by a star which rose in the east. The infant was found wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger. Was born in Bethlehem. Was searched for by wise men who saw his star. So the same star that rose in the east, the wise men saw from someplace, wherever they may have been. And seen by the wise men with the star coming to rest over his house in Bethlehem somehow. How does a star rest? That's kind of a mysterious saying, which hopefully will resolve for you. The Gospel of Luke provides additional historical insights to these events. And if you go back and read Luke in your gospel, in your Bibles, you'll find some very interesting comments, which you might even wonder, why are they there? But when you look at them and then do this arithmetic I'm about to show you, you'll find out why, I think. In the days of Herod, the king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah of the division of Abijah. Okay, we know of Zechariah, right? The father later on of John. Of the division of Abijah, he was a priest in the high temple, and the priests of the temple served as part of a division, of which there were 24. And each served at the temple 1 week, twice a year, and then there were 2 weeks that were overlapping that they'd choose. The Abijah division was the 8th division. So basically, we can go back and begin to calculate this. Since the first division started its service on the first day of Nisan, in Exodus, book 40, right? One can calculate when Zechariah began his service as part of the Abijah division, provided we know which year is involved. We can then use the fact that his son John was 6 months older than Jesus, also found in the Bible, to hone in on a likely birth period for Jesus. Luke references an enrollment that Joseph and Mary were required to attend. Modern research has uncovered, as we saw before, what Luke was describing was the loyalty enrollment to Caesar Augustus. So given the facts we know about Herod's actions and the temple service of Zechariah, Jesus was likely conceived in late 4 BC and born 9 months later, based upon all these correlations of timing. In 4 BC, Zechariah would have served in the temple from May 19th to May 26th. Since he was struck speechless in the temple, in Luke 1:20, you'll see that, he could only serve there during his first course of service. Shortly thereafter, his wife Elizabeth conceived and later on gave birth to John, probably an early March of 3 BC. Thus, using Luke's information, it would place the birth of Jesus sometime in September of 3 BC. The Gospel of Matthew details for us what happened in Jerusalem. Now remember, this is Matthew sort of condensing all the events surrounding the birth and the short time thereafter of Jesus. He says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." Okay, note, he was born in Bethlehem of Judea, past tense, during the time of King Herod. That tells you who is king. That Magi came from the east to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is he? Because we want to worship him." We saw his star in the east. So we have to be able to explain the star in the east, for example, when we're talking about the Star of Bethlehem. When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. Two things right away. It appears that Herod doesn't know anything about a star, nor do the people of Jerusalem, which frankly is fairly possible back in those days. If they were in Jerusalem and there's smoke or whatever occurring over the city, the sky is going to be somewhat obscured and you're not going to be a sky worker. You go out into the countryside where the shepherds take care of sheep, for example, the sky is ablaze with color and brilliance. So they'd see things that maybe Herod wouldn't. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and the teachers of the law, those are his wise men, he asked them where the Christ was to be born. "In Bethlehem of Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will be the shepherd of my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. So he is looking for the star that rose in the east, as described at the beginning of Matthew. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and make careful search for this child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him." And after they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star that they had seen in the east went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. Now, how can a star, A, go ahead of them, and B, stop? We shall see there is a particular set of planetary actions that permit both those events to occur. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother. Now notice there, it says coming to the house. It doesn't talk about a manger. It talks about a house. And they saw the child, not a babe, but a child, with his mother, Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold and of incense and of myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by a different route. Later on, we'll find out as you continue to read the scriptures that Herod would send his troops to kill all the males 2 years old and younger in Bethlehem. Why? Probably has to do with what the Magi told him about when they first saw his star, before the time that the Magi visited. Now, interestingly, there's been issues in the scriptures about a particular statement in the book of Luke. There's always been an issue with Luke's statement about the census conducted by Quirinius, who was the governor of Syria in 6 AD. The Greek text of Luke is as follows, and you can see it there, all right? And it translates into the English as, this first census came about while Quirinius was governing Syria. Note, however, that's the current translation, right? That's possible to translate the word in the middle, Pipote, whatever pronounce, I can't pronounce it, not first, but as before, or prior. The same word is translated in the Acts as former, which means in the book of Acts, it's called former. So a scholar, a Greek scholar by the name of Nigel Turner, has suggested that a better translation of Luke 2:2 would be, this census was before the census taken when Quirinius was governor, prior to the census taken when Quirinius was governor, indicating the census of Augustus, which wasn't a census at all, but basically a pledge. If this latter translation is correct, the census involving Joseph and Mary was conducted before the census of Quirinius in 6 AD. It was conducted back in 3 AD. Now, interestingly, just to go back in the history, the writers of the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD consistently dated Jesus' birth to between 3 and 2 BC. And this is important because, for one thing, since Mary and Joseph signed a pledge of allegiance to Caesar Augustus, that record was visible in Rome. There were libraries in Rome that had these records, and a good researcher might be able to access them and actually see when this was signed. Those records were obviously subsequently destroyed in various fires, etc. But so therefore these early writers might have had a much better idea than we do because they had closer records to the time of Jesus' birth. Okay, according to Clement of Alexandria, Jesus was born in the 28th year of Augustus' rule of Egypt. This rule of Egypt is dated from the Battle of Actium on September 2nd, 31 BC. And the Egyptian custom was to count the inaugural year of a ruler's reign as an ascension year, with the next year being year 1. So the ascension year is year 0, accession year rather is year 0, and the first year of the reign after that is year 1. Doing this arithmetic, Augustus' 28th year as ruler of Egypt would have been run from Tut 1, August 24th of 3 BC, to Tut 1, August 24th of 2 BC. So we have a range now, based on those records, of when it was likely that Jesus was born. Eusebius states that Jesus was born in the 42nd year of Octavian. Octavian was only later proclaimed Augustus by the Roman Senate. Octavian and Mark Antony ruled jointly beginning March 17th of 44 BC. From this date, 42 years brings us to the date between March 3rd of 3 BC and March 2nd of 2 BC. So we've now got dates, if you take those two together and you say August 24th is one date, and you look at the other work by Eusebius, March 2nd is the second, and we have a period between August 24th and March 2nd as the most likely time, based upon these ancient scholars, for the birth of Christ. In addition, Tertullian and Origen state that Augustus ruled for another 15 full years after Jesus' birth. Jesus died on August 19th, AD 14, which brings us once again to that 3 to 2 BC era. So we've got a reason to believe that the right era for the birth of Jesus is between 3 and 2 BC, and it looks like it occurred between sort of August 24th of 3 BC and March 2nd of 2 BC. Now, from the Magi's point of view, they'd be looking at the skies. Let's presume for the moment that they were in Babylon, but they could have been in any of the Persian parts of the empire, some of the other empires around. We don't know. And since travel times were long and expensive to travel the distance to Jerusalem, particularly if you were from Babylon, for example, you'd typically go up the trade routes around the sort of desert area between what is now Iraq and Israel. That would take months. So what you'd want to do is plan your trip with great certainty as to when the events occurred. When they looked at the sky in 3 BC, in August, what they would see in the sky just before dawn are two planets. They would call them stars at the time. They actually had names for them. We call them Venus and Jupiter, nearly touching. They're right above the star Regulus, which in the Magi's analysis of the skies was called the regal or royal star. And Jupiter was the king star, and Venus the mother star. So you put all together, and you've got a birth of a royalty, who's a great royalty because he's both the Jupiter star and regal and Regulus are there in his place in the sky when he's born. This is a modern example of what it looked like in the sky, would look like in the sky if a similar conjunction occurred today of Jupiter and Venus. These are actually further apart by a good deal than Jupiter and Venus would have been back in the in 3 BC. You can see Regulus on the star up here as part of Leo, and then you see the two Jupiter and Venus down here looking to the west at dusk. Then on June 17th, another and even more spectacular conjunction occurred of Jupiter and Venus. Here they are, just under Leo here. You can see Regulus over here. And what you see is this, they look like almost one dot on the sky. They're that close, which means they were extremely bright. Next to the moon, the brightest object in the sky. So it would have lit up brightly, and that given where it was located in the sky and the travelers of the planets involved, the Magi would have been looking with increased interest at the birth of a great king in Leo, the lion, which was associated with Judea and what we now call Israel, the Jews. This is a close-up. If we took a look at that sky and really sort of zoomed in on it, and get you can't separate them. It's in this particular close-up, they're 26th arc seconds apart, that close. So they appeared almost as one to anybody with a really brilliant good eye could not separate them. They appeared as one very bright object and be seen, and nothing like it would be seen again in the sky for at least another 1,500 years when you got a fairly close approximation to the brightness of that star, but in a different part of the sky. If you had a telescope at the time, which they weren't around, but if you had one, you would have seen Jupiter just above Venus in the telescope eye, with Venus showing a phase, about almost like a half moon phase, for lack of a better description, and Jupiter above it with some of Jupiter's satellites showing as bright spots around it. But they were that close. And if you looked at it from the ground, unless you were a Berber who was practiced at looking at the sky in the desert, you could not distinguish them from being one object. They were, and very bright. So I'm guessing that this event got the Magi ready to think that the great leader has come. He's here, he's coming. But before we go that far, the Gospel of Matthew makes another observation. It's what the Magi told Herod. We have seen his star at its rising. So for them to see his star at its rising, they were looking for it, which means they must have been looking for something like Jupiter and Venus, or Jupiter itself, which is the king star, rising. And the concept of a rising star basically says that the object in the sky is rising in the morning at the same time the sun does. That's what's called its rising, right? It's called the Hellenical rising of Jupiter. And Jupiter is seen coming up at the same time as the sun in the morning, so you almost can't see it. In fact, you practically can't. But it shows up in the sky, and that's what they were talking about when they were talking to Herod. And that occurred around August 12th to 3 BC. And in September, there was a unique alignment of the stars, which could be seen everywhere in the Middle East. You had Jupiter contacting Regulus, the brightest star in Leo, with Venus in the constellation of Virgo, the Virgin, the mother star and the Virgin together, and Jupiter, the king, and Regulus together. The brightest star in Leo and the star of a king together, meaning royalty had come. This occurred on September 11th, 3 BC, near dusk. This is what they were looking for over 400 years. Interestingly, we can continue to use the Jewish calendar to see if there was any possible spiritual significance to this time period, because the Magi were looking at one set of things, but they weren't necessarily looking at Jewish symbolism, etc. But the Jews could have been if they were looking for the star that indicated the Messiah had come. Interestingly, at that time, September 11th, 3 BC, it marked the start of Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets, the Jewish New Year, which took place on Tishrei 1 and 2. It's the start of everything new. The old has been put behind us and the new is opened up to us on Rosh Hashanah. And we have this event occurring in the sky. Rosh Hashanah itself marks the coronation of God as King of the universe and represents a time of rebirth, reflection, and repentance for all Jews. So this is a great and holy event that's just occurred. And by September 14th, a few days later, Jupiter and Regulus made their closest approach in the dawn eastern sky, with Venus now firmly into the Virgo constellation. So the king is here. That's a proclamation. He's arrived. He's now with us in the sky. And the Magi would have known how to look for it. This is a picture, as we see the modern constellations, of the sky at the time at dawn, when the Magi would have been looking for some sort of sign of his actual presence. Now, later and further on, an unusual occurrence, will happen again a little bit later, Jupiter went very near Regulus 3 times over an 8-month period, starting in September of 3 BC. So Jupiter is going to go, it's called retrograde motion as we know it now. And what it looks like to us here on Earth is that Jupiter is in effect making a circle around Regulus. Almost looks like it's putting a halo over Regulus before moving on. This happens from time to time with planets all the time, but the actual proximity of these objects the way they are is kind of unique. Jupiter's first conjunction occurred on September 14th during the Jewish feast of Rosh Hashanah, at the beginning of a time of renewal. The second conjunction occurred on February 17th, 2 BC, the Jewish feast of Purim, which is a celebration of the Jewish deliverance from slavery in the book of Esther. So this king who came is connected with renewing the Jews, delivering them from slavery, and lastly, giving them the Torah, the word of God. The wisdom of God was given to the people of Israel by this king who just came. The Jews could easily interpret what they saw if they knew what they were looking for that way. That conjunction occurred on May 8th, the Jewish feast of Shavuot, which commemorates the day God gave the Torah to the Jews. The Jupiter, circled Regulus 3 times due to its retrograde motion and seemed to crown Regulus. Again, a distinct sign to the Magi, and we're now in 2 BC, right, of the kingship with Jupiter as his star. So now they know that Jupiter is his star because it's made these actions in the sky, and that's the star that needs to be followed. So this occurrence is the very unusual sequence of events in the heavens likely caused the Magi to seek out the new king, as indicated by these occurrences, just to go over them again to sort of make the point. The bright conjunction of Jupiter and Venus in the constellation of Leo rose with the sun in the east. The close conjunction of Jupiter and Regulus in the constellation of Leo with Venus in the constellation of Virgo appeared to give notice to an important birth. The triple retrograde motion of Jupiter around Regulus and Leo over a period of 8 months seemed to point to a regal birth of a very important king. an anointed one, as they were told by Daniel. And they would also know from that anointed one, just remember what Daniel said, he's going to be cut off, that he would be, in effect, cut off. He would die sometime during a period after his birth, obviously, but in a fairly unique way, because it was remarked the way it was in that vision. The stunning and very bright conjunction of Jupiter and Venus and Leo on June 17th pointed to a very unique king, perhaps or likely the anointed one that Daniel had foretold their forefathers about. It may be because if this was the anointed one who was to be cut off, that one of the kings one of the Magi brought frankincense and myrrh. I should mention here that the Magi themselves were not kings, nor were there necessarily three of them. There could have been a dozen, or there could have been two. We don't know. There's a minimum probably of three, because there were three gifts mentioned in the scriptures, all having to do with gifts that you give a king. But the frankincense and myrrh gift is unusual, particularly to bring to a young child, because they were often used in burial. But it might indicate that the Magi knew this was the anointed one and he was going to be killed. All of these events and all of their interpretation, it probably took them a little time to put it together, undoubtedly caused the Magi to follow the star that caused all of this, Jupiter, so they could find and worship the anointed king that they believed had arrived. So after meeting with Herod in Jerusalem, Herod directed him to go down to Bethlehem, which is only located 5 miles south of Jerusalem. It's not a long trip. And overhead, they saw Jupiter again. It had followed them to where they were. And there it is as they look south, looking right down on Bethlehem, letting them know that they were in the right place. Perhaps unbeknownst to them, don't know, but it's not mentioned in any of the text I've seen. There's another constellation much closer to where Bethlehem's located on the horizon, the Constellation of Crooks, the cross, shining just above the horizon and pointing from Jupiter down to the Crooks, down to Bethlehem, located down where the arrow was down here. So there was more to the event than even the Magi realized. And based upon this, we think that the Magi probably got to Bethlehem around December 24th, December 25th of 2 BC, because the following events occurred in the sky at that time. At that time, on the evening of the 24th, the Feast of Hanukkah began, the feast of the rededication of the temple to the service of God, known as the Festival of Lights. And what do Jews do on Hanukkah? Exchange gifts. This is when the child Jesus received the gifts from the Magi. Interestingly, starting on Tuesday, December 24th, and continuing for 4 more days, Jupiter appeared to stand still over Bethlehem. It reached its stillness point in here, and as seen from Earth, it would have looked like it was not moving at all. It stood still over the city. It reached its stationary point as a result of its retrograde motion, as we know now. But from their point of view, it was pointing directly down for at least 4 days, starting on the 24th, but continuing for 4 more days. So it's possible that the Magi brought their gifts and worshiped the toddler king, because remember, it's now 2 BC, not 3 BC. So that the little baby that was in the manger is now roughly 15 months old, living in a house in Bethlehem. And they visited him during the 6 days of Hanukkah, what we now call the Christmas season, when gifts are exchanged. And Matthew notes, when they were come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary, his mother. Now, this is a sort of a sketch of what a typical Roman era village house would look like. It might have been built like as you see described here, it might have been built on the side of a rock outcropping or a cave. depending on what was available at the time. But whatever it was, they would have had a section in the back of the house to take care of animals and whatnot. The stable area would have been out over here. They would have had a guest room upstairs over here, and they would have been living in something like this when the Magi visited them. Because again, it's roughly 15 months after he was born. So in summary then, Matthew and Luke identify some key features related to the events surrounding the time that Jesus was born. He was born during the reign of Herod. Magi from the east came to Jerusalem. Could be Baghdad, it could be any of the cities along that corridor over there. Could be in Persia, could be some of the other city-states, but they came from a distance and from the east of where Jerusalem is. They came to worship the new king of the Jews. Why would somebody from that area worship anybody who's a Jew? Only if they connected with the prophecies of Daniel, who was a holy anointed one, was come. That's why they came to worship. The star that moved them into action rose in the east, and we now see what that means is Jupiter rising after it had been sort of behind the sun. You couldn't see it. It then starts to show up again, coming up now in a different place at around the same time the sun rises in the morning. The star appeared at an exact time. They told Herod when it was. Herod did not know when it appeared or where his Jewish king could be found, which is really odd. You would have thought that they would have been watching the skies, and no, but they didn't. For whatever reason, they didn't. The star lasted for a fairly long time. The Jupiter is moving through the sky over time. It goes retrograde over a 4 or 5 day period, moves on, so it's up there for a long period of time. The star itself went ahead of the Magi as they made their way to Jerusalem, because it was constantly rising in the sky. It looked like it was moving ahead of them. The star appeared to stop in the heavens when seen from Jerusalem. That's that retrograde motion. All of which match modern astronomical results produced by astronomy software and the historical data we now have available to us. In other words, you match the sky activity with the historical data, with the scriptures, and you have sort of a lock on the events of the sky and the events on the earth. So, what was that Christmas star that everybody was talking about last December 2020? Remember that one? It was the talk of the town for the month of December till Christmas. And what it was is a conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter. They're called a grand conjunction because it occurs roughly that close every roughly 400 years. And where it was in the sky didn't match anything having to do with the birth of the Messiah. It was different, but it has other implications. It has the implication based upon how the Magi would have interpreted events like this would have been a great harvesting is to come. Usually it meant agriculture, but it could mean something else. We don't know. But that's what that would have meant. But it would not have indicated that we're about to see the Messiah return that day or something like that. That's not what this portends. It was probably called a Christmas star because it occurred at the beginning of winter on December 21st, the winter solstice. And it occurred that evening around 5 o'clock or so. So you could actually look up and see it in the sky. And depending upon when you looked, it would have been higher or lower than, depending on where you were. But it would look like bright, but they would be separate. They wouldn't be that close compared to what we saw with Venus and Jupiter. But nonetheless, the Magi, if they were allowed today, would have seen that and interpreted it most likely as the time of harvest to come. And that time is roughly 20 years or so. But it's a time of harvest in the future. And again, the question is, what kind of harvest is it? We don't know. So what I'd like to say at this point is that we've seen what the Star of Bethlehem was, and it wasn't a comet, and it wasn't a supernova. It was a rare alignment of planets, the way we just showed, which, because of all the ways they occurred in the sky, matched what was going on the earth with religious significance and spiritual significance 1-to-1. So it's a very unique event. And because of that, a very unique person came into the world, Jesus of Nazareth. So our wishes for you at from the Shroud Center are a most joyous Christmas season to all of you. And remember that Jesus is the true reason for this season. Even the heavens have proclaimed it. Thank you.